So we'll talk about incentives tomorrow. Today is about contracts, and want to talk today about second layer contracts above the blockchain, particularly about payment channels and payment networks. And these are about moving money from one point to the other. Nothing more fancy, but they transcend the capabilities of the underlying blockchain, and I think they're a premier example of smart contracts, actual smart contracts that work. I'll talk about a few protocols that do that, and I'll center on our own T-chain protocol that uses secure, trusted execution environments, the Intel SGX, and what it allows you to achieve. There's a cherry on top, which is that you're able to do with this technology instant payments. And by instant, I mean asynchronous. You don't need to access the blockchain in order to complete your first payment. So Alice sends money to Bob, and she doesn't have to touch the blockchain in order to do that. But bear with me for about half of the talk until we reach this point. So the scaling problem, we want the blockchain to process a lot of transactions quickly, but the blockchain is a central entity and we have a lot of users. This is probably more accurate. We have a lot of users, and a blockchain cannot process all their transactions fast enough, as we see in operational chains. So we have a limited throughput, limited due to the protocol and to the performance of the individual nodes that run it, and limited latency. This is a queuing system. It takes time. You put a transaction out there, and until it gets placed in a block, it takes time. It is possible to improve things, and you'll hear about that tomorrow. There is the infamous block size debate in Bitcoin, and Ethereum is a bit easier on that. It lets the network decide on how large it wants its blocks to be, but whatever you do, you're still limited by the power of the individual miners before you do sharding, at least. There are even more advanced blockchains. You'll hear a lot about these tomorrow. But again, the limit is still there, but what we would have wanted to do is to have the users of the cryptocurrency directly pay one another. Why is this a challenge? Because we want to prevent two things. We want to prevent payment cancellation. So if Alice pays Bob, she can't later say, I didn't pay you. And we want to prevent double spending. Alice can't tell both Bob and Carol that she paid both of them with the same coin. Now, the furthest back I got about this is Sham's eCash. This is from '83, long before blockchains. And if you know the work, then you know the goals are different. This is about privacy, but still there are similarities. So Sham has a central bank, and the bank gave these vouchers to the clients, and they were able to do the payments offline. And if someone cheated, then they would be punished in retrospect by the bank. Now, what if we could do something like that with a blockchain? And the answer is it's possible, and the idea is called payment channels. A lot of the problems are avoided by having a payment channel only between two parties. So the two parties have a channel, and then you don't have the issue of double spending, because there are only two. Payment cancellation or non-repudiation is avoided with crypto signatures that cannot be forged. And all of this is going to be enforced by the blockchain. So we're going to get hard guarantees. It's not, maybe I'll punish you after the fact. Now, if you remember Joe's talk from the morning, he said when you penalize something with a blockchain, the worst you can penalize them is with some money they have already committed to securing whatever operation they were doing. You can't find them. You're not a bank, and you don't have their actual address. So this is the worst you can do. And so in the case of preventing double spending, this is critical to have only 2 points, because if you had Alice paying to Bob and Carol, she could also be paying Dave, and et cetera, and many others. So whatever the amount that she's putting as a collateral, she could do more double spending than that. So you're limited really to 2 parties. The basic infrastructure is like this. You have each party place a deposit on the blockchain as collateral. They pay each other with direct communication, so they send messages to one another that facilitate the payment. And what we want is for each of them to be able at any point in time to go and leave. Say, okay, I'm done with this channel, I'm taking what's mine, and I'm going home. And they shouldn't be able to take more than they should. And this happens with a transaction that is placed on the blockchain. So when Alice thinks she has some amount, she can actually go back home with that amount by placing a transaction on the blockchain, and Bob can't prevent her from doing that. So let's start with a toy example, a unidirectional channel. So Alice wants to pay Bob. Everything below the blue line is the blockchain. Everything above it is data structures that they hold and transact. So this is a little bit cut off, but we have a setup transaction here. And the setup transaction is some money that Alice placed on the blockchain, and you need two signatures to use it, her signature and Bob's. When Alice wants to pay Bob, she sends him a transaction that spends this setup transaction, takes all the money out of the setup transaction, and pays let's say she's paying $3. So it's paying $97 back to Alice and $3 to Bob. Now, once Bob gets this transaction, he only has Alice's signature on it because Alice could only produce her signature. If he wants to walk out, he adds his signature, places it on the blockchain, and he's done. Now let's say Alice wants to pay another $2. So she pays a new transaction to Bob. Now 95 go back to Alice and 5 go to Bob. And if Bob wants to go home, he signs this transaction. He obviously wouldn't sign the first transaction because it gives him less money. And Alice can't use these transactions to place on the blockchain and somehow walk with 97 back home because she doesn't have Bob's signature. She doesn't see it until he decides he's done and he places it on the blockchain. And finally, we see that we have a refund transaction. Alice doesn't publish her setup transaction before a refund transaction exists, and this refund transaction gives all the deposit money back to Alice, but only after a certain time has passed. So the channel is set up for, let's say, 1 week. During this week, this can all happen, and Bob has to terminate the channel and settle the channel on the blockchain before 1 week has passed. Once 1 week has passed, the refund transaction becomes valid. Alice can place it on the blockchain and go back home. So the channel is time limited. So this is easy enough. Now let's do a bidirectional channel. We want them both to pay one another, right? So 2 deposits and we're done? No. The difficulty is that, recall, we want each party to be able to settle at any time. So each party at any time can produce a transaction that gives it whatever it should get. But at the same time, we don't want any party to be able to settle the channel at an early state. So Alice pays something to Bob, and then she settles the channel at a state that is before her payment. This should not be possible. This is the source of the difficulty. So here's an easy solution. Let's do just 2 one-directional channels going in both directions. Each of them is independent. They work as before, but the catch is that once one channel is depleted, you have to go to the deposit and finish it, even if there is enough left. So here, Alice deposited 100 and sent 100 to Bob, and Bob deposited 100 and sent 50 to Alice. But now Alice can't send anything back to Bob, even though the balance is such that she can send 50 back, right? So I'll talk about 3 solutions. The first 2 a little bit more briefly. Let's start with duplex micropayment channels. Micropayment because you make a lot of small payments. This is from Decker and Wattenhofer. The concept here is that we're going to have 2 independent unidirectional channels, but when they're depleted, we're going to update them in a more balanced state. And let's see how this is done. So first of all, we have setup transactions which ends up in the blockchain. They both put in their deposits. And then they form this invalidation tree. Each transaction in the invalidation tree is time locked, so it can only be spent after time t. It can only be placed on the blockchain after some far point in time, next week. This is time t. And at the very end, we have two outputs for the two individual channels. So just a word about time lock channels. It's not possible to, time lock transactions. It's not possible to place them on the blockchain until the time has arrived. They might be superseded by other transactions which are locked earlier or don't have a time lock at all. And obviously they're transitive. So if we have a transaction that depends on a time lock transaction, we can only place it after the time of the earliest, the time of the first transaction has been reached. And then finally at the end, we have the actual payment channels. These are the channels as we saw them before. So we have the output with two signatures, and it can be updated by incentive. So Alice sends more and more to Bob, and Bob will always use the latest transaction if he wants to terminate earlier. But now let's say that one side is depleted. This is the problem we had before, right? So the credit from Alice to Bob is reached 0, and we want to update. So we form a new branch in the tree with the first transaction time locked being a little bit earlier. So these channels become valid because this branch can be placed on the blockchain earlier than the top branch. Maybe this here. Yeah. So because this transaction can be placed before the one above it, then this branch becomes valid. Whoever is better off on this branch is going to place this transaction before anyone has the chance of placing the top transaction. And once this channel is depleted, we go to a new channel, and then we update the time lock here. And then finally here. And the entire system is parameterized by the maximum time when we want our channels to stop, and what's the depth we're willing to put here. And the trade-off is on complexity. So if both are done at some point and they agree to terminate, then they form a terminating transaction. They put the single transaction with both their signatures on the blockchain, and we're done. But if they disagree, so one of them is misbehaving, then we'll need to place the entire branch on the blockchain. So this is the depth of the tree plus two transactions. And that's the complexity. So we have a motivation to keep it lower. So we still have a bounded amount that can be transacted in each direction, depending on the number of resets you can do. And the transaction is time limited. You need to keep an eye on the blockchain to make sure you haven't reached the timeout and need to place your transactions. So Lightning Network takes a different approach. I'm going to be very quick about this one. They do coordinated state updates. So they don't do the two individual unidirectional channels anymore. They say, let's both agree on the current state of our channel. So when can Bob decide that he has been paid by Alice? He receives two things. He receives the capability to terminate at the current state, so a transaction he can place on the blockchain that is going to give him whatever he deserves. And also a capability to void an attempt by Alice to do the same with a previous state. So after Bob is paid, if Alice tries to place a transaction that gives her her money according to the state before she had paid, Bob already has a transaction that aborts Alice's transaction and penalizes her. The implication is that Bob needs to keep all historical states in memory. He has to be prepared for Alice trying to do this for every previous transaction in the past. So we need 1.5 with optimizations round trip per payment. So this is an idea that came out from Poon and Rija in 2016, two entrepreneurs. Now there are 2 or 3 companies that do versions of these protocols. These are not identical. The most mature one we found is the one from the company Lightning Networks, and they were very cooperative in the evaluation. And so the best we got was 1.5 round trip per payment, about 0.4 seconds in our experiments that I'll describe later. And you need to process the state updates sequentially. So one is done, the next is done, the next is done. They're doing batching, so aggregating all transactions and then doing state updates for the aggregates to make things more efficient. But in essence, you need to do the updates sequentially. So starting to move on towards T-chain, we get back to this problem. Each party can settle a channel at any time in a payment channel, means that it can produce a settlement transaction. And this is the problem we want to overcome. So I'll talk now about our T-chain protocol, trusted execution environment payment channels. I'll talk a bit about what SGX is. I'll show you how a single operation works and why it is asynchronous, why we're able to do the first payment before ever touching the blockchain, and how we overcome crash faults of the SGX. And if we'll have time, I'll talk about the chain scenario as well. So SGX in about one slide. SGX is a technology from Intel. The general technology is called Trusted Execution Environment. Trusted Execution Environment. The Intel processor has an instruction that tells it run secure code. And we need to trust Intel for doing so. We also need to trust some code that we want to run on this processor. Now, what the system guarantees is that everything running inside the CPU is confidential. So even the person running the CPU and the computer has no access and no visibility into what happens inside. Integrity, meaning that they're not able to change, and not knowing what they're doing or not knowing what they're doing, they're not able to change the operation of the program. And finally, and critically, remote attestation. So once the program is done, we're able to prove, so if I'm running something on my SGX, I'm able to prove to you that the output of my program is the correct output of a program running on the trusted processor. So the processor outputs I'll show you in a second the details. But before we'll talk about the attestation, the important point is that this is resilient even if you don't trust the application code that's running the secured code. So the operating system, the virtual environment, anything. The hardware doesn't have to be trusted, including memory. So what goes out to memory is all encrypted. And the attestation, proving that we've run what we said we're running, includes 3 parts. So first of all, the output of the program that I'm claiming that is the correct output. Second is the fingerprint of the code. So in our case, we're going to run T-chain code. And Alice is going to prove to Bob, this is the output of the T-chain code you know and love. And finally, a signature from Intel saying this is our processor and it's running according to our parameters, what it should be running. And Bob can verify all of that. This is a good point to ask anything about SGX if it was too quick. Yeah. You're asking if a third party needs to confirm this?
You want to eliminate the third-party bank or something to acknowledge transaction, right? But here, you're saying, okay, it's not a bank, it's Intel, right?
No, I'm going to use it in a different way. That's an excellent question. Let's just look at this as a CPU for now, and I'll show you how we use it in a second. We're not going that way. Okay, so let me try to move forward then. So what we're going to do, and this is a technical report. There was an initial, these are my co-authors. There was an initial report in the Bitcoin workshop last year. The key point is that we're going to let the trusted execution environments keep the secret keys. So they're going to have the capabilities. They're going to be able to create the transactions that go down to the blockchain. So Alice, who's communicating with Bob, is not going to be able to obtain the transaction only by getting it from her trusted execution environment. And her trusted execution environment is going to only produce it once. And so she's not going to be able to go back to a previous state of the system. And this is the strawman that I guess you were asking about. This is not about having a single trusted party. We didn't have to use Intel SGX to get a trusted party. This is not about having a trusted party run the entire thing. Because the reality of using a trusted execution environment is this. You have some entity in the middle. And this entity is running the SGX. The SGX doesn't have access to the world. It's just a CPU. And so this malicious Carol up there, she could be, after the deposits are locked by Alice and Bob, she could toss the SGX, and then neither of them would have the money. We want to avoid that. We want them both to be able at any point in time to take what they deserve and leave. So channel setup. Before we even start, when we want to start a channel between Alice and Bob, we're going to do a public key exchange. We use Diffie-Hellman. And we're going to do this with the attestations. So when Alice receives Bob public key, it is given with an attestation from Bob's SGX that this is really a private key, public key that is generated by a trusted execution environment that is running the T-chain code. So it is trustworthy for doing our exchanges. And then each TEE generates its own private key. And let's look at Alice here. Alice sends deposits onto the blockchain paid to her trusted execution environment's Bitcoin address, or Ethereum. Let's talk Bitcoin. Bitcoin address. And now the funds are in the blockchain. Of course, Alice's TE doesn't have access to the blockchain, so it can't verify anything. But Alice tells it, these are the deposits I've put on the blockchain. Now, when Alice speaks with Bob, they form a channel. This could happen after, way after the deposits were placed. And Alice asks her trusted execution environment, tell Bob that this deposit, A3, is locked towards our red channel, associated with our red channel. And then Bob is in charge of looking at the blockchain, seeing that really the deposit is there. Because it has the message from Alice's trusted execution environment, it knows that this really is locked behind a secret key that was generated within the SGX. So a secret key that no one, including Alice, has access to. And so he sends this information to its own trusted execution environment and saying, this is really okay, I'm going to use this as collateral. So after both of them are done placing their collaterals and each verifies that the other has really done what it should, they can start paying each other. Let's say Alice wants to pay Bob now. Alice tells her trusted execution environment, I want to pay Bob. The TEE decrements whatever amount she has paid and creates a message to Bob, signed within the TEE. Once Bob receives this message, so a single message going this way, it's done. Once it received the message, it knows that Alice's trusted execution environment committed to the payment. Alice will not be able to go back. The payment is done. A cute feature of this is that if Alice, let's say Alice's deposit here isn't necessary for the red channel anymore, because Bob owes her money and not the other way around, then she can dissociate the lock from the deposit. This has to be done carefully, of course. We need Bob's confirmation that he's not relying on this anymore. But once we get Bob's confirmation, this lock can be removed. And if she asks to dissociate the channel, the deposit, and Bob stops participating, we don't want Bob to keep the money locked. Alice can tell her trusted execution environment, okay, I'm done with this channel. Please release all the deposits at the correct balance and place the correct deposit, and the channel is then terminated. And the deposit is no longer accessible. So once one of them chooses to stop, they terminate the channel. They take whatever they need out of the deposits on both sides, and the channel is done. So the point I was telling you about earlier is the following. Once the deposits are on the blockchain, Alice and Bob can start making the transactions without touching it. So here, Alice and Bob are both on the left here in a land with excellent internet connection, and they place their deposits, and they both have an up-to-date picture of where the blockchain is. And now they go in a ship and they travel to a faraway island where there's no internet connection. They just have their SGXs with them. They form a connection there on the island, never accessing the internet. They do transactions back and forth, and once one of them comes back, they're able to place the settlement transaction on the chain, and they're done. Ten more minutes, okay. So I'll talk a little bit about this, and then we're done. The fact that the funds are now locked in an account that is secured by the trusted execution environment means that if Alice's computer fails, so the electricity is down, the money is lost. There's no way to back this up. And one way to overcome this is using what's called monotonic count. So let's say first, what's one good way not to do this? Suppose we have a backup plan. So Alice can tell her SGX, okay, I want to back up the current state. And the SGX is able to do this in a confidential way, so the backup is not legible to Alice. She can't learn anything about her private key from the backup. Then she reboots her computer, loads the state, and then she can continue participating in the channel. If you do this naively, then Alice can do this multiple times and store the various old state of the system. And when she decides it's time to go home, she loads the state where she has the most money, and then tells the trusted execution environment, okay, this is now. Please give me the terminating transaction. So instead, we're using the monotonic counters. The monotonic counters are a feature that actually sits on the management environment, which is separate from the actual CPU. And it provides, as the name implies, monotonic counters that are associated with the specific enclave, the specific program running on the SGX. So when we want to take a snapshot of the state and store it to disk, we do this by incrementing the monotonic counter and associating it with the backup. So if we do another backup, then the old backup is no longer valid because its monotonic counter is no longer valid. But this is slow. This is really slow. So Intel intentionally put delay on these monotonic counters for its own reasons. You can only do about 10 of these per second. So this is a solution that we actually like, but it only applies if if you do this infrequently. So if we are willing to only do 10 backups per second or a backup every minute, that's going to be fine with you. If you're a home user, that should work out fine in most cases. But if you're a large Bitcoin exchange interacting with some Bitcoin bank and you have a lot of transactions happening simultaneously, that's not going to cut it. And the alternative, which requires more resources if you want to do this, but is to use a form of chain replication. Well, chain replication is a classical replication technique, but this is a slight twist. So we have 3 SGXs chained, and these together form Alice's side, or Bob's side, let's say Alice's side. So you issue a command, it goes to the first SGX, it does the processing, sends it with its attestations, proving it came out of the SGX, to the second, to the third SGX, and then the last one sends the command output. So every command has to go through all 3 SGXs. More latency, but if one of them stops behaving, you can go to either of the remaining ones and tell it, okay, we're done, let's terminate the channel. And then it will give you the settlement transaction. But then, because we don't want this to happen multiple times at different states, once this happens, the chain stops. So it cannot continue to operate with new commands. It's terminated and we're done. This obviously requires more resources. If you do this on 3 laptops purchased on the same day on your at home with all the same failure modes, it's not going to work. This is only useful if you're actually using different machines, running probably different software, and probably on different racks, or even better on different data centers. So this really applies to larger institutes that really need the high bandwidth. So we ran an experiment. We had a machine at Cornell and a couple of machines at Imperial College London and a student at the Technion. And he was running this experiment. And we compared these options. So at the top there is Lightning, which I told you about earlier. They were able to do about 1,000 transactions per second with about 400 millisecond latency, just running between the 2 points. Note that for Lightning, you can back everything up. It's all in the clear. And so you don't need the fancy backup schemes that we needed for SGX. So SGX without any fault tolerance gets 2 orders of magnitude better bandwidth. As expected, when you use the 10 millisecond delayed monotonic counters, you get 10 transactions per second. Sorry, 100 millisecond delayed. And then with chain replication, we're able to get more than an order of magnitude improvement. So this gets you good fault tolerance and excellent performance across the Atlantic. We use this in 2 different modes. One is that we used 2 backup, so 2-step chain at Imperial, and then did the transaction across the Atlantic. And the other, we did the transaction, the payment inside Imperial, and used the Cornell machine as the backup. And the results were about the same as expected. So due to time limitations, I'm going to skip the chain protocol, which is complicated, and I'll be done here and take questions. Thank you very much.